Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Mark Bergen. Javier Leiva has lived in the Carolinas for the past decade. In 2017, the Raleigh man began hosting the Pretend podcast. Pretend is a documentary-style true crime podcast about real people pretending to be someone else. Last year alone, Pretend surpassed 5 million audio downloads. Plus, a Spotify billboard featured Pretend on a Times Square billboard in New York City. Leiva spoke with WRAL News about how he's covered con artists, cult leaders, and even debunked claims made in the movie Catch Me If You Can. Here's what that conversation sounded like. Javier, we get to tell your background in podcasting. Thanks so much for joining. I want to start here. How did you start podcasting?
Well, I worked in news and TV news years ago, like at the beginning of my career, and I was also making documentaries for the local PBS station. And eventually I got out of news and I got, a regular job, a normal people job. And I missed it. I missed telling stories. I missed going out into the field and investigating and just talking to people. And so I started the Pretend podcast as a hobby, just to get back to my news days and do some investigations. And it quickly took off, which took me by surprise.
How did your news background help you in your coverage, in your analysis, in your storytelling ability as part of the Pretend podcast?
Yeah, I mean, when you're part of a local news team, you have to really dig for information. You have to build relationships with people out in the community and make contacts. And I just got this rush of every time I went out looking for a story and being able, this from being in news yourself, that being assigned the story at the beginning of the day and turning it around, have it edited on the air by 5:00. It is a feat that you have to repeat every single day. That was exhilarating. I try to bring that same energy to my podcast, right? Where you're hearing directly from the people themselves. So I Pretend is a podcast about con artists and people using deception. I try every time to get the perpetrator, the con artist, the person, the subject of the show on the episode so you could actually hear from them. And I also interviewed the victims. And you hear first person what these people's stories are about. And that's where I'm pulling from my early days in news.
So how did you decide, okay, I want to go from news into the podcast space?
Because when you're what story is assigned, what's happening that day, I kind of wanted to have editorial control. And I came up with this concept about deception, people pretending to be someone else. And I just thought that was awesome that I could focus on that one niche, like that one area of storytelling. And so that's kind of where I'm leveraging my news days, but I'm also editorially being in control of what I want to cover.
So you start Pretend, was it 2017 that I read that Pretend started?
Yeah, 2017.
How did you decide, not only do I want to do this podcast, what I'm also curious about is when you decide to do a series of the show, who to cover, what to cover, what's that process like for you?
Yeah, well, in the early days when I first started the podcast, I didn't even think it was going to be true crime. I thought Pretend was going to be stories about like ghostwriters, actors, more human interest type stories. And quickly I found out that the crime stories were the ones that really stuck with people. And so I kind of just followed that angle, just the Pretend angle, but it kind of fell into the true crime space. And it took 10 episodes for me to really know what the show is about. I did one series where I investigated a very extreme church out in Western North Carolina. Some people call it a cult. And that's how I kicked off the podcast. And so then after I finished that story, I was like, well, what else? What can I do? And I started interviewing people with different backgrounds, and I just found that the concept of pretending is so flexible. Like I could really go anywhere with it. And so like after 10 episodes, I knew what this show was about. And I've interviewed the real Donnie Brasco. Now he's an example of a person pretending, but for good, right? He was deep undercover with the FBI for I think the longest undercover assignment that, on record, and he was pretending. And so that it's just fascinating. And all these years later, I haven't run out of ideas, and I'm still just as excited as I was day one.
What's the most surprising thing that you learned when you interviewed the real Donnie Brasco?
The most surprising thing about that particular person, Donnie Brasco, is that character, that persona of Donnie Brasco, was not that far removed from Joe, the real guy. You know what I mean? Like, I think a lot of people assume that to be a good con artist, we have to take on a completely different persona. And he didn't. He was himself. And so, therefore, when he was in situations where he had to react on the fly, he was reacting as himself, therefore adding that credibility and that authenticity to that character. It wasn't an extreme.
Yeah. So Donnie Brasco, and then I've listened to personally the 8-episode series you had on Frank Abagnale Jr., the real
Yes.
man who Catch Me If
Real.
You Can is loosely based on. You've debunked a lot of the mystique around Frank Abagnale Jr. as depicted in the movie and in his book. How did that start? And then, I mean, it's an 8-part series, so there's a lot to it. Yeah. But like also in the episodes too, you heard from listeners and viewers who helped shape and further the narrative and the storytelling. How did that start? And then how did that evolve into what it became?
That whole thing started because I have a podcast about con artists, and I was like, I have to have the biggest con artist of them all, which is Frank Abagnale, the subject of Catch Me If You Can. It was just like a bucket list interview that I wanted, and he said no. He turned down my interview, and if he would have just said yes, I think I would have just bought the story hook, line, and sinker. But because he said no, I started digging and looking into it, and then I found a book. It was an independently published book by Alan Logan that pretty much debunked the whole story of Catch Me If You Can. Like, he sometimes posed as a pilot, but he was never a doctor. He was never posing as a lawyer or a professor. And he did not run from the FBI for 5 years. And when I heard that, it was so shocking because, it's such a great movie and such a great story. And many people have heard Frank Abagnale talk about this amazing life that apparently he never lived. And so Alan Logan challenged me. He goes, you know what? Try to recreate my research. And I did. I took out a bunch of public records that confirmed that the real Frank Abagnale from the age of 16 to 21 couldn't have done any of those stunts at all because he was in prison the entire time. And I actually went up to Las Vegas and ambushed Frank Abagnale after one of his speeches to ask him about this. And so I have one of the only recorded interviews with Frank Abagnale confronting him about this phony life story that we've been sold for decades.
What was that like for you to go out to Vegas and ask him the questions face to face?
Yeah, well, at first he tried to spin it, telling me that I got my timeline wrong, and then I pulled out his prison card, which had the dates on it, showing that he couldn't have done this, and I got him to admit that he had nothing to do with his own autobiography or the movie, and he basically walked back the entire thing and tried to separate himself from the story that he's been selling himself for decades.
What's the feedback you've gotten from people since you put out that 8-part series specifically about Frank Abagnale Jr.?
People like you are probably like, wow, this is amazing. I didn't know any of that. But a lot of people, and I'm talking daily, I get comments on YouTube like, leave the guy alone. It's a good story. It's a movie. Movies are supposed to be 100% true. And I agree. Movies, especially biopics, aren't supposed to be 100% true. This is not even like 5% true. Okay, this is a work of fiction, which is really funny because he is a con man, but just not the con man you think he is, right? His real life story, what he was really doing to me is actually more interesting than the story that we were sold by Hollywood and Steven Spielberg. In fact, I think they should make a new movie and based on his real life events, and I think audiences will love it.
It almost gets into what people want to believe to be real versus what reality actually is. And I think that specific series really gets into the human psyche of that.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting about that is that Frank Abagnale, you're right, like people want to believe, but Frank Abagnale has actually served this fake persona that he created has served as an inspiration to ex-felons or like people who are coming out of prison, white collar offenders that are trying to start over and build a new life because this man, Frank Abagnale, he's always wearing a suit. He's speaking at all these conferences. He seems very successful, very knowledgeable. And in a way, he's almost like a beacon of hope to people who are trying to start their lives over again. So even though it's based on a fake story, he does seem to be an inspiration to people like that. Time and time again, when I interview con artists, they always cite Frank Abagnale as somebody who they aspire to be, somebody who could turn it around, even though his life story was completely bogus.
WRAL News reached out to Abagnale's camp to see what he had to say about Leiva's findings in the Pretend podcast. We reached out to Warren Jones, who's listed as a spokesperson on Abagnale's website. Here's what Jones had to say in a written statement to WRAL News. Jones claimed not to have ever heard of the Pretend podcast before, but this is what he said, quote, "The limited media output that has been negative toward Mr. Abagnale typically excludes his almost 50 years of working with the FBI and his successful efforts to help individuals and companies protect against fraud, identity theft, and cyber scams. It's this experience, well documented over the past 4 decades, that forms the content of Mr. Abagnale's highly praised keynote speeches. The life events depicted in various stories occurred more than 50 years ago when Mr. Abagnale was a teenager. He's 74 years old and feels that what he did was immoral, illegal, and unethical. He served his time more than 45 years ago for those events and has paid his debt to society. He has no desire to discuss his past. The movie about Mr. Abagnale's early adulthood years 50 years ago was scripted to entertain, as was the Broadway musical several years ago. Mr. Abagnale wasn't consulted about any of the story elements in either production," end quote. Let's take a quick break. So you obviously come from a reporting background, so you know how to look into all this, to file a records request. I know you mentioned on your show that you have a fact checker. What other help do you get to make sure that what you are reporting on and saying and analyzing and who you're speaking with, that it is actually true? Because if you're making accusations against someone else saying, hey, wait a second, none of this is true, how do you make sure all of that is in fact accurate?
Yeah, I mean, I do have a producer who, two producers that work with me, and it is good to have that second layer so that we don't have any blind spots, right? But also, if I'm going to say something on my podcast, I would love to back it up with some real evidence, right? So, in the case of the Frank Abagnale story, all those documents are on my website. I've made YouTube videos. You can see the prison card yourself. You can see the records, the penitentiary records. Yeah, so all of that is out there. I take a lot of pride in making sure that what I'm saying is factual and not just opinion based. So that's why I'm trying to go to the source. A lot of times you get a lot of he said, she said. I like to make sure that both sides are represented so that you, the audience, could digest that information and take everything into account and come up with your own conclusion. I'm not trying to sway somebody one way or the other most of the time. So yeah, I mean, it's tough because I'm not part of this large media organization with a legal team and news directors and producers and independent journalists, which I believe are going to be a big part of, or are already a big part of our media diet, right? this is a challenge that every independent journalist has that they're going to have to face. They're going to have to be there, a very tight ship, fact checking department, producing. Like wear many hats and do it responsibly.
So I want to backtrack here a little bit. You start Pretend in 2017. What was the first like aha or breakthrough moment that you had where it's like, whoa, people are actually really, really consuming and downloading and listening to this?
Yeah, I think so. I told you I started the podcast reporting on this cult in Western North Carolina, and that quickly took off because there was a lot of interest in that, and not just in North Carolina. There was interest around the world about this particular story. So right away, the podcast picked up. But I think when it really became apparent to me was maybe like 3 seasons in that the leader of that church in Western North Carolina actually emailed me and said that she wanted me to spend the day with her at her church and to realize that, okay, wait a minute, what the stories that I'm saying are really important. And this church recognizes that this is a platform that's worth taking interest in and participating in, that was worth their time. And I thought, wow, okay, this is bigger than me at this point.
So did you take her up on that offer?
Oh yeah. She emailed me on Saturday and I was there on Sunday and I spent the whole day. She actually performed like a deliverance on me, like some a form of exorcism. They have a screaming prayer and it was frightening, but for the most part they were very welcoming and it was they gave me a lot of access. Obviously it was very controlled access. I felt like a lot of what I was experiencing was a performance for me. I felt like that whole service was just for me, right? And for my audience. But it was very nerve-wracking at first, but worthwhile. I jumped on that offer right away.
So how do you convince someone to establish the trust to where even if you're making accusations against them that they might not want to hear that depicts them in a bad limelight? How do you have that trust to say, hey, I want to make sure I'd imagine it's your, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'd imagine it's trying to find what the truth is. But how do you have that trust with, again, confronting Frank Abagnale, being invited to this church, other people you've covered in the podcasting you've done in your career?
Yeah, I mean, with the church, I felt like the validation that they felt that I was going to give them a fair shake, that I wasn't just my point was not to just attack them, but even all my stories. I'm always surprised because the concept of my show is flawed, right? Like, oh, I interview con artists. Well, you would think that after you interview the first con artist that nobody would come on my show, right? It's like, oh my God, this guy interviews con artists. But I don't find that that's a problem at all. With the exception of Frank Abagnale, most people do want to come on my show because I think that they've listened to my past work and they feel like I'm pretty objective and that I'm going to give them space to tell their story. And I feel like that's really an important thing that I've done because it makes sure that next time I approach somebody else that they would feel like I'm going to treat their story with respect. If I was just going after people and, I don't think I would have much of a show.
So in the true crime space, what are things that you do to differentiate the podcast that you host and produce compared to all the other true crime podcasts that are out there?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question because I'm personally not a true crime fan. I don't watch the true crime documentaries. I don't, I don't, I would do terrible at a serial killer trivia contest. That's not my cup of tea. I don't like the gory blood and guts stories. I always tell people that Pretend and even the Ponzi playbook, they're diet true crime, where we're talking more about white collar crime. We're talking about crime that, in my opinion, sometimes is affects more people than some of the violent crimes that we hear so much in movies and Netflix documentaries. I think a white collar offender could destroy a lot more lives than a single serial killer. And these are stories that are just as important and most likely we would have an encounter with a a narcissistic, sociopathic, white collar offender than we would uh, a serial killer. You know what I mean? So it's good if you listen to my podcast. Collectively, you are learning what to do and what not to do in certain situations, romance scams, all kinds of that. But the most important lesson I tell my audience is that if you think you're smart, if you think you're smarter than the con artist, if you think that couldn't possibly get conned, you're probably ripe for the picking. So that's the most important lesson. You can be as prepared as possible, but never be too comfortable, you know?
Along those lines, was there ever someone who was victimized that reached out to you that was most surprising in all of the different entities and people and con artists that you've covered?
Yes. There's a case of Anita Barney, she's the widow of a Wendy's CEO. So this lady inherited a fortune, right? And she was being targeted by an former Ohio State quarterback, Art Schlichter, and had a bad gambling habit. I don't think there was a romantic relationship there, but they formed a friendship, and he would ask her for money, and she would loan it out, and he eventually drained her entire bank account, if you could imagine that. It got to the point. This is a sweet little old lady. She's now broke, and now he is asking her friends for money, essentially scamming them out of money because of the situation that she found herself in. So I just thought that was so surprising. A woman who would have never, ever in a million years have been caught doing anything wrong because of the situation she found herself in. She ended up becoming a perpetrator too, inadvertently. And I just find that interesting how we don't even know how we're going to react if we're in that situation.
What came of that? What ended up, how did that situation end up, I guess?
You know, he ended up going to prison. He passed away. She's living a very modest, normal life. We keep in touch every now and then, but yeah, I mean, her life is not going to be the same. You know, it's crazy. She was supposed to retire with a fortune. I mean, and he took it all from her, and she, hey, it's life, right? But it completely changed her life.
All right, this is going to be my favorite part of the interview. Pretend was featured on a billboard in New York City in Times Square.
Yeah.
What's that like for you to see your face in Pretend in Times
That
Square?
was weird. Yeah. I don't think that will ever happen again, but Pretend was chosen out of 5 podcasts by Spotify for a creator program that they had. And as part of that program, they were going to promote the shows, but they also had a billboard, in New York City. It was 2 billboards. It was crazy. And it's so funny because it's such a New York thing, right? I fly my mom there because, of course, my mom has to see it. And only my mom and I are looking at the billboard. All the New Yorkers are just like passing by, just like getting, rushing to wherever they're going, and very typical New York fashion. So my mom and I enjoyed seeing the billboard. It was cool.
Hey, that's where I push back respectfully, and it's like you're like wallpaper in Times Square is what it sounds like to me, man. That's a big deal.
Yeah,
It's a big deal.
It's a cool bragging moment. Yeah.
That's congrats to you on that too, by the way, because I'm sure that there were dozens, hundreds, probably thousands of other podcasts that are part of that process, and to be featured by Spotify, that's a big deal, man.
For some reason, there's somebody at Spotify who listens to my podcast and she just really enjoys it. And, that's everything that has happened to me. I've had a Netflix show based on one of my episodes. I've had a Discovery ID show based off of one of my episodes. Everything that has come out of this is just because I've done this podcast, which is nuts, and I just focus on delivering good content, and all these other things that happen because of it. It's just, blows me away because that was never the intention, right? The intention was just to tell really compelling stories. And so it's really cool that I've had so many awesome experiences that came from something that I do in my walk-in closet, right?
So hang on just a second. A Netflix show, flex a little bit here, but if you could explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, what a lot of people don't realize is that because creating podcasts is so much easier than actually shooting a documentary. The podcast becomes like a proof of concept. And a lot of Hollywood producers and production companies are listening to multiple podcasts, especially in the true crime category. And I get calls all the time from production companies like, hey, I want to do this story. I want to do that story. And so, in a way, it's like this documentary that I'm creating with just your ears, right? Like just sound. They're seeing the potential. Like I made it so that somebody could listen to a 30-minute episode. Like, yes, that could be the next Tiddler Swindler or Tiger King or
So
something
is this
like that.
something that's in production right now then?
No, the documentary is called Don't Pick Up the Phone on Netflix and Citizen PI on Discovery ID. And those are out. And I'm actually in the works with 2 production companies right now on 2 different stories. So we'll see what happens.
Excellent. And that's actually a
Yeah.
perfect segue because I know you've got your first episode of the new season out of Ponzi Playbook, hundreds of millions of dollars in a Ponzi scheme. What can listeners expect in the episodes ahead of the Ponzi Playbook?
Yeah, well, we did season 1 where Neil McTighe and I just talk about one Ponzi scheme per episode. And, at first I remember asking I have an agent, and I was like, hey, do you think any network would like this Ponzi Playbook show? And he goes, nah, it doesn't have any legs, and in a way she's right, because every Ponzi scheme is exactly the same. All right. It works mechanically exactly the same. But where she was wrong was that each Ponzi has a different flavor, right? So there's affinity Ponzi schemes where you could have a pastor creating a Ponzi scheme within a church. There was a cow manure Ponzi scheme where, this guy was selling these investments and turning cow manure into energy. There's, a watch Ponzi scheme. Every episode, you'd be surprised. We're just doing one right now for season 2 where it's the Gucci goddess, there's just, each episode is so surprising how different it is. And actually in season 2, we actually speak with a Ponzi schemer. So look out for that interview. That should be pretty good.
Excellent. Javier, if there's anything else you need to plug, if there's anything I haven't asked you about with what you're doing in the podcasting space, the floor is yours. This has been terrific.
Oh, yeah. I mean, really, I think listening to Pretend is a good starting point. And you could find Pretend on all the social media platforms and every podcast platform out there. So just search Pretend. It's usually the first thing that pops up. My social media handle is Pretend Pod. But yeah, I mean, it's a good starting point that leads you into this world of deception.
Thanks to Javier Leiva for joining me today, and thank you for listening to the WRAL Daily Download. If you listen to this podcast on WRAL.com or the WRAL News app, you can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Follow the show so you don't miss an episode. Thank you for listening.